I'm D.S. Martin. I am a Canadian writing from the Toronto area. I write poetry and I edit poetry with the Poiema Poetry Series. It's a delight for me to work with so many great poets in the series, and it's just an extension of what I do with my own poetry. I love the interacting with words, playing with words, thinking about things that really matter, writing about things that matter, trying to even discover what I believe about things. I think that's a lot of the process of writing. It's a good question, because as I think about becoming a poet, it's kind of like in the same way as, becoming a person, like who you are. I believe in many ways I feel I was called to be a poet, although I wouldn't ever have said that when I was young. I wasn't one who was really good at school, goofing off and not focusing on things. And interestingly enough, I find out as an adult that a lot of poets went through those types of experiences. They weren't people who would tend to focus on what you were supposed to focus on in school. You tend to be distracted by things. And it's often, and in our society, those distractions, it's like, no, you got to focus on the thing at hand. But often it's the distractions, there's something important going on over there too. It's just not pertinent to what we're doing here, but there's something going on over there. And being drawn to that and thinking about that, that's part of my character, which I think is kind of interesting. Drives my wife nuts, but it's kind of interesting being drawn to focus on the other things. I love language. I'm very musical, although I'm not a musician, so I'm very drawn to music in language and music outside. I've always been a music fanatic, collecting lots of CDs, listening to music, going to concerts. And I became very interested in the well-crafted lyrics of songs. But then after a while, I start growing dissatisfied, because a lot of good songwriters at certain points, well, there's more than just the lyrics they're writing. They're writing different things. And sometimes the lyrics with a lot of songwriters, it just isn't as well-crafted in one way, because they're doing something else with melody or instrumentation or something else that's very valid. But sometimes you want to craft that writing just a little better. And I found that that's when I started being drawn towards poetry. Also, another thing that has really drawn me, I think, to poetry is growing up as an evangelical in a church where the Bible was respected in such a way that every word mattered. It wasn't just a general statement. It was every word had meaning, and to focus in on that meaning and try to discern what that meaning might be, even though it's in translation, but to look at different translations and to discern the meaning and to try to put it into words. That respect for language, those things all kind of flowed together for me. So I think, those three things, my very distractibility, my love of music, and the respect of language for the scriptures, those things all came together, I think, very significantly to call me to be a poet. I mean, I believe God called me to be a poet, but I don't want to put it up, in the same way as a preacher or a missionary, but I think it's still a calling. Does the capuchin monkey, hanging from his prehensile tail, see the stars? Or just a speckled ceiling beyond the Peruvian jungle's darkening canopy? When his gathering of palm nuts is hindered by the approach of creeping night, might he stop to consider those points of light? Might he, staring into the deep, comprehend their distance, their size, their number, and then wonder? Or is his imagination limited to foraging and wedging himself in high treetops for his night's sleep? Might he be overcome with awe? Or is the sight of a shadowy snake or a slinking cat at the foot of his tree his only cause of fright? A man walking the terraces of night might be preoccupied with inconsequential things and not notice the insufficiently bright smudge of Andromeda's spiral on a moonless night. But should he stop to marvel at the sky's expanse, his considerations measure more than space and time. For numbers are only the foothold from which his imaginations leap, thrusts toward the sublime. Might it be his own shadow, the shadow of God's image stretching across the galaxies, that carries such consequence, since merely seeing such blotches of light seems to have no teeth to bite a lesser mind? We are left, like Pascal, terrified by the silence. Kingdom Poets is an idea that popped into my head at one point. It's where I just thought I would create a blog and just write about Christian poets. My thought about blogging is that the post should be very brief, because if people want to read something long, it doesn't tend to be what you do online. You pop into something, if it's long, you say, well, I'll read it later. So I wanted to do something brief. But the idea was to be an encouragement to people that there's a real interaction between poetry and faith, that there's amazing poetry out there that is written by people of faith and has been through the years, and just to post a poem or two from a poet, say a little bit about them, and I do that every Monday. And I thought, I might even, I'll do this for a year. I can do it, it's 52 weeks. I can find 52 poets to write about. Now, that was in February of 2010. We're now in 2016. So 6 years later, I'm still going. Now, it's true that some poets I've done a second or third time, such as John Milton or Lucy Shaw. But a lot of the poets, it's just once so far that I've written something about them. So whether it's somebody such as George Herbert, or whether it's someone like one of the poets in the series, such as Robert Siegel, whether it's someone from a totally different part of the world. I've written about Australian poets and Singapore poets and Japanese poets and African poets. I've also included all denominational backgrounds. So it isn't just those who are drawn towards Catholicism or to Protestant or evangelical or Orthodox, but in fact to say this is a place where we celebrate poetry. In some way, I'm trying to be an encouragement to poets, those who are living, to be able to present their work, and even a preserver or a reminder of the great stuff that's gone in the past. Some of the poets I do are very, very well known. Some are ones that have kind of slipped a little bit more into obscurity, or from time to time someone becomes obscure, and then they come back. Suddenly people are celebrating them. And part of that, what I'd like to do is even just to play my tiny part in drawing people back to say, hey, check out this poet, because she was doing something really interesting. What she was doing was valuable. And what's nice there too is I'm also trying to do varying styles. So if people really love poetry that is metrical or traditional rhyming schemes, they'll find lots of that there, but also poetry of all types of styles. The key is I want to choose poets that take their Christian faith seriously. And that sometimes involves people who waffle on the edge of Christianity, but I really try to focus on poets who have called themselves Christian, or people have referred to them as Christian. And I'm sure there are times that some of these poets will have waffled back and forth, but primarily it's people who are pretty clear that they are believers. So, because you can't always know. I don't always find, when you're finding things about poets, you don't always find out, okay, and here they have signed this statement of faith. There's quite a variety there, but I just find it exciting to find new poets all the time who have spoken profoundly about faith. It's because of course poets write about things that matter. So of course you're going to talk about your perception of the universe, about what God is doing. So I just find Kingdom Poets is fun. I have people reading it from all over the planet every day. Maybe not in the thousands, but sometimes it's in the hundreds, and people coming back to it, and it's become kind of a resource. If somebody wants to know about Christian poets, it's it's become a good place to go to, at least for a start. I don't do big biographies of anybody. I just give some basic information and tell a little bit about them. But it's a great place for people to discover poets, read something, see it's something they like, and then they can go elsewhere to dive deeper and to find more. Well, obviously a person's individual tastes come into it, because some people just naturally love sonnets and villanelles, whereas others want poetry that's more free verse. But there are certain principles that come through. Just how well edited something is, that it's as tight as possible, that it is using language precisely. It's not just talking in generalities or proclaiming platitudes, but it's trying to get at something in specific ways that make sense, or that seek to make sense, and that they're honest. In fact, even when they're trying to make sense, even admitting when they don't, they're having trouble getting at that. So I think poetry is, first of all, it's a place to be honest. So it's not a place to start saying what you want to believe, but it's a place to try to find what you do believe. It's not a place to play political games by towing a political line, to say, oh, this is what I think, when it's only something that that's what people want you to think. It's a place to explore, to be open to possibilities. Part of the distractibility I talked about before, it seems ironic, but it comes down to also being very focused at a time. Sometimes I can focus on things and just block everything else out, which of course that also drives my wife crazy in the opposite direction from what I was saying before. I think it's just a matter of, I've learned to love poetry, to focus on what works. I think one of the things the poets really appreciate is they found someone who cares enough about what they're doing to really dedicate as much time as possible to it. I don't tell them what to do, I make suggestions, because it is still their poetry, not mine. And I'm just one reader who comes along and says, well, when I read this line, it's a little ambiguous to me, or would this be better if it was tightened up, or if you put a comma here, it might make it clearer what it means. And then I sometimes find out that what I thought what they meant wasn't even what they meant, so then therefore that changes things again. I think it's just the fact that I'm willing to dedicate myself to give my total attention to it. And of course the poets appreciate that, because they've poured their life into this work. They're not writing poetry because they're trying to become famous or because they want to become rich. Because if they started that way, they soon learned that that's not what happens. They do it because they love it, and that's what they feel called to do. So for me to come alongside and pour as much of myself as I can into it and give it that kind of attention, even if I make some comment, some suggestion that makes absolutely no sense to them, at least they are able to think about what I've said and say, no, that's not quite right. And even though I'm coming from sometimes a different geographic area, I sometimes find that a poet will have used a phrase which is quite common in their hometown or their home state or wherever, that sounds a little bit different to my Canadian ear. So sometimes I'll suggest something saying, that doesn't seem quite right to me, and I realize later that's because that's not the way they say it in Canada. So it's being sensitive to that, to be listening, to pay attention, to respect what they're saying, to respect what they're doing, and just to, this might sound cliche, but to pour love into their work. That I dedicate and love their work. I give it so much attention. And of course, I don't know a poet who wouldn't appreciate that. Just like anybody who's doing the art, someone who really focuses in on what they're doing and really pays attention and realizes what they're doing and says, wow. I'm not saying that strokes their ego. It makes them real. It helps them to sense just how important what they're doing is, that it is appreciated and valued. So I think that's why they appreciate my editing, because I just appreciate them. It's sometimes hard. It's sometimes a balance of various things. For example, I can only do so much at a time. I'm a full-time teacher. I'm a father and a husband, and I'm involved in lots of other things in my life besides being a poet and editor. So sometimes a really fine manuscript comes along and I'm going, well, if they're willing to wait a while, I might be able to get to it. So sometimes it's timing. And sometimes I say no simply because I know I won't get to it. Marjorie Maddox had submitted her previous manuscript for the series, and I passed it over not because it wasn't wonderful, but because I just knew that I just had so much I couldn't handle anymore. And I was delighted when her next manuscript came through, True, False, None of the Above, which was just appeared last week. I was just delighted to be able to work with her. I know there was another book, I'm trying to think of the poet's name, who submitted something to the series. It's slipping my mind, so I won't even go for it. And I know Whitfenstock picked it up, and it was one I really wanted to do, but I knew I just couldn't at the time. That's one aspect. Another aspect is I feel I'm good at what I do, but I need to realize that I can't do everything. That I'm not the ultimate poetry editor in every sense. I can do well what I do. Sometimes I read a manuscript and I say, I can tell this is good, but I don't know if I could make this any better. Maybe it might be that I'm not in tune enough with where they're coming from, or their style is just so much different than mine, or it may be content. Philip C. Collins submitted a very interesting manuscript to me about Emmett Till. He's from New Orleans. And an interesting manuscript, and I liked it. The problem is a lot of it's written in dialect. And part of it is, being a Canadian, for me to try to improve on his dialect is hardly legitimate. And the other thing is that because it's written in dialect, it doesn't kind of fit with what I do about trying to tighten the words, because if I helped him, tried to get him to tighten it all up, then he's going to lose the voice that he's seeking there. It just wasn't something that I could do. I know it's been accepted for somewhere. I can't remember where it's been accepted. He sent me an email to tell me that it was going to appear. So I'm delighted that the book's going to appear, but it just wasn't one that I could make into a better book. So I thought that would not be a good fit for the series. You also mentioned about spiritual poems, that faith is really a dominant thing. I really want that. I mean, obviously, I don't believe that Christians who are poets need to be always waving the flag of their faith, but I do sense that the series at least has a certain expectation of that, I would say. Like, readers coming to the series have an expectation because of what we've done in the past to try to find a balance. So some poets who maybe don't always, shall we say, use the phrase, wave the flag of their faith in their poetry, or do it sparingly, might have if you bring a number of their poems together from different seasons, that they would have enough that would make that kind of collection. And that's what Robert Cording did. I mean, obviously he didn't need us to publish another book of his poems because he already, is, well established. But he saw an affinity with the collection that he wanted to become part of, which was delightful. So it was really wonderful to be able to do a collection with him of his spiritual poems. This poem from Poiema is, it is about when my grandfather was an ambulance attendant during World War I, and he and the girl that let's just say, there was a girl who was a friend of his. They weren't dating or anything like that. They were just friends at first. And then through correspondence, they grew a little bit more bold. But understand this is during wartime, and this is at a time when correspondence wasn't like a click, 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 click. It was a long time in between. And understand that during wartime, everything had to be censored because you didn't want any, if the letter fell into the wrong hands, to have any information about troop movements or anything else for the enemy to be aware of. Anyway, so this poem is called Censorship. And again, this is about my grandparents when they were, even before they were romantically involved, or at least admitting it to each other. Censorship. She is so far away that his words take more than a month to span the gap. Based on this equation, I am more than 800 times further away down a one-way street, holding his words in their guarded plastic sleeves. He must be careful what he says. Even an orderly in the ambulance corps needs to be censored. So he speaks in generalities of their destination and their activities, and of her brother with trench fever. The moon moving through the clouds sings of his loneliness, and of the girl on Princess Avenue, down whose sidewalk his mind freely moves, even though an ocean and a war block his way. He censors himself, for the blind ping-pong of their relationship is like the image of a horse-drawn ambulance moving beyond a line of trees, though perhaps as unnerving and unpredictable as Fritzy's big guns. Her most recent response is to something distant and preliminary. She doesn't know that after 18 months, he's finally advanced through dangerous terrain to the word love. A quarter of my genetic makeup is in the hand that pens the words, and a quarter in the hand that eagerly opens the envelope. And so I know in my bones what he can only hope. Well, Christian, I have to admit, when we first started talking about the series here at the Festival of Faith and Writing, is that 2010? I think it was 2010. I was excited, but I also thought, yeah, I've had wonderful conversations with delightful people who are dreaming the same sort of dreams that I'm dreaming, but it won't happen. But I just go along with this. This is great, and if it ever did, wow. And then when you contacted me about a year later we'd been in touch in between, but when you got in touch with me about a year later and said, hey, let's do it, I was just blown away because I'm not as well established as a lot of other people out there. I don't teach university, which an awful lot of our poets do. I live in Canada. I'm of the 19 books in our series, there's only 2 of us Canadians, everybody else is Americans. So just even that I'm not as well known, perhaps because I don't live in the same area and I don't have the academic credentials that most of the poets in the series would be working at an academic level. So I was really delighted to have the opportunity, and when it started forming together, and it just blew me away how quickly things grew, that I was able to not just have random things coming across the transom, but that I could contact the poets who I was a huge fan of and say, are you interested in doing a book? And to actually have them get excited about the possibility of working together and where it's gone. It's just been so delightful. And then to have other people who I really see as amazing poets approach me and say, I have a book, would you be interested? It's just like, wow, this is amazing to be able to work with the people I've been able to work with. It's just been so exciting. If you had asked me back in 2010, 2011, or even 2012 when we started, when our first book came out, where I thought it would go, there's no way I would have said that by 2016 we'd have 19 books. I mean, that has a lot to do with the generosity of Whitfenstock, really. I mean, that they were so willing to take poetry and pour them, give the freedom for poetry, because you and I both know that poetry doesn't make money for a press. But the goal doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be about creating books that matter. And that to me is just so exciting, to have the support, the freedom, the trust. And I just feel I just want to cherish that and, in turn, reciprocate in any way I can by doing the very best job I can with the series. Where it's going, I don't know. So far, we have not had any poets put a second book out in the series, but I know that's going to change soon, because I have a few of the poets who are starting to talk to me. Although I'm not set that poets who've published with us should therefore feel any obligation to continue. In fact, I find it delightful to be able to work interchangeably with such presses as Paraclete or Word Farm, who've produced wonderful books as well, and have perhaps produced some books by poets who then come to us, or poets who have been with us and then go to them, that it works so well that, back before Poiema started, there were just not as many books in the true, in the Christian vein as would have liked to see. Lots of Christian poets would get a book published through a university press or through some other press, but to have a consistent series like this where people could go, okay, I've read this book and I see these others in the series and I know this is a good book, so I'm going to start looking into these other authors and see, read their work online, check it out and say, oh, here's another poet that I really like. So it's a resource, just like Kingdom Poets is a resource of one sense. It's a resource for those who are interested in Christian poetry. And I also feel a real desire to not just encourage poets, but encourage those who are young who may aspire to become poets or to become other types of artists, that their faith and their art can go together, and that there's encouragement there, that I want to help that to happen in any way I can. So I had another blog I did called the 55 Project, which was about Isaiah 55. And I just had poets submit poems that they had written based on that wonderful chapter. And some of them were very established poets, a few from the series, and some were people who were really quite young or hadn't had a lot of publishing experience, but they wrote a fine poem. Just to be able to encourage poets is something I desire to do. And that's another reason I'm mentioning that. The anthology, Adam and Eve and the Riders of the Apocalypse, about biblical characters, to write poems in the voice of biblical characters or to write poems about biblical characters, I think would make a wonderful anthology, and to bring in established poets there, but also to give a chance for some who maybe aren't that established but can write a fine poem, a chance to have their work alongside, some of these amazing poets. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I read just about everything I could get my hands on from C.S. Lewis. I happen to be a very slow reader, so that's saying a lot. So I would seek it out, and as you know, there's a lot of books out there that have his name on them. So I would seek it out and find whatever I could, and I read just about everything I could. And then I moved on to other things, still had all those Lewis books on the shelf, and would dip into them from time to time, especially the fiction. But then I just at one point decided I was going to reread Mere Christianity, which I did. And what amazed me was, as I started I read that, I was, first of all, amazed at how he wrote analogies for things. He would be talking about something which is spiritual, so therefore it's hard to talk about something spiritual It doesn't. So he would compare it to something else that we can more sink our teeth into, something physical or some human experience. And he was so good at analogies. And it struck me that those analogies could be fleshed out and played with and see what could happen with them. So I don't even remember which was the first poem I wrote. But I wrote something based on something in Mere Christianity. I can't remember which poem it was, but then I just started reading more and more Lewis again, and I started thinking about how, just his thinking. And what surprised me, and maybe it surprises me now that it surprised me, was that so many of the things, the ways I thought about things, the ways I thought about God, the ways I thought about spirituality, that so many of my ideas were actually ideas I'd got from Lewis and had just internalized. I'd wrestled with the things he'd said and thought about them a lot, and basically those ideas had become my own, although originating with him. So it's just surprised me when I read things and went, I forgot that was Lewis. I thought that was something that I'd come to thought of, or, oh, that's from Lewis too, and just how it all flowed together. I mean, he was so good at writing in so many different ways that there were just so many places to dip into. And one of his friends once said that in anything that C.S. Lewis said or anything that C.S. Lewis wrote was present everything he said and thought and wrote, that it was all so intertwined, and it's true. He had this amazing ability to absorb everything. He read voraciously. He read far more probably in a year than I would read in 10. Well, that's no exaggeration. And he would absorb it and remember it. The content, the style, just amazing. So I just fascinated with the man because of his thinking, the way he came up with things, the way he wrote poetically, the beauty in the way he did things. So to be able to draw those things together, different aspects of it that came out, it just became an obsession for me to try to capture more about who Lewis was and to read more of his stuff to try to get at various aspects of him. And of course, the idea with the book too is once people have dipped into the book, that it would inspire them to go back to Lewis, and even if they've read Lewis before, to go back to it and go, oh yes, that thought, that idea, which maybe you read once and you thought about, but maybe you slipped aside, but needs to be thought through again. This poem is called Thirst, and the first two lines are actually taken from C.S. Lewis from his book, The Great Divorce. And again, it's one of his analogies again, one of his thoughts, and I take this analogy and then I run with it. And I run with it in whatever direction I possibly can. Not necessarily where he would have taken it, but I think it interplays with it so that you get at the possibilities. So this poem is called Thirst. Thirst was made for water, inquiry for truth. Raindrops were made for roots. Roots were made for soil. Soil for life. Life for glory. Raindrops were made for glory. Listen. Roof drumming. Eaves dripping. Look. Glisten. Sunlight catching. Luminous liquid. Inexpressible proof of something. Spoken by growling skies. Skies were made for glory. Wings were made for skies. Feathers for wings, among other things, such as sheltering and beauty, but mostly for the glory of soaring. Water was made for skies and rain, for trickle, for gurgle, for rivulet, stream, creek, and river, for puddle, pond, lake, and ocean, for sip, for swallow, for swim and sail, submerge and drown, for hiding, inquiry, and eventual discovery, a sparkling glass of truth.